Mary lived in a small house near the edge of the city. The paint on her porch railing was fading, but she kept the steps clean every morning. She was an old black woman with calm eyes and careful hands. Neighbors knew her as someone who greeted everyone with respect. She always carried a small bag when she walked to the corner store. Inside the bag were simple things like bread, tea, and sometimes candy for the kids nearby. Mary did not have much, but she gave what she could. Mary had one son named Daniel. People in the neighborhood spoke about him like he was a distant shadow. Some said he worked overseas. Some said he was a private security man. Mary never corrected anyone. She only smiled and said he worked far away and stayed busy. She did not share details because she believed some things were safer when kept quiet. She also believed that a person should be known for kindness, not for status. On most evenings, Mary sat on her front steps and watched the street. She liked the way the air cooled after sunset. She liked hearing the sound of distant traffic mixed with the soft talk of neighbors. Sometimes she waved at a young mother pushing a stroller. Sometimes she nodded at the mailman who always seemed in a hurry. Sometimes she just listened to the city breathe. Mary had learned to find peace in small moments. The neighborhood was not perfect, but it had its own rhythm. Most people were working families trying to survive. They shared tools, shared rides, and shared advice. They also shared worry, especially when rumors spread about rising tension in the area. There had been complaints recently about noise and suspicious activity near the block. People felt nervous because they feared being misunderstood. Mary understood that feeling deeply. That week, Mary noticed more patrol cars than usual. She did not judge the presence, but it made her stomach tighten. She had lived long enough to know that fear could grow on both sides. She had seen how a simple mistake could become a big tragedy. Mary prayed quietly each night for calm and wisdom. She prayed for the officers to show patience. She prayed for the community to stay steady. On a cold evening, Mary returned from the store later than normal. The sky was already dark, and a light wind pushed dry leaves across the sidewalk. Mary held her bag close and walked carefully. Her knees ached, and she did not want to slip. As she reached her gate, she heard sharp voices a few houses down. She stopped for a moment, not to gossip, but to understand if someone needed help. She saw flashing lights reflecting off windows. She heard someone speak loudly, and then another voice answered with panic. Mary's heart began to pound. She did not like conflict, and she did not like the way fear sounded in the air. She turned toward her porch, hoping to get inside quickly. She wanted to lock her door and call a neighbor to check on them later. But as she stepped onto her path, an officer noticed her movement near the gate. The officer called out a command. Mary froze because she was startled. She could not tell who the command was meant for. Her hands were full, and her hearing was not strong anymore. Mary tried to respond, but her voice came out small. She lifted one hand slightly, trying to show she was not a threat. The bag slipped a little, and the sound of cans shifting inside seemed loud in the silence. Another officer moved closer, and the tension tightened like a rope. Mary's mind raced. She wanted to explain that she was only coming home. She wanted to show her bag and her store receipt. She wanted to ask why they were shouting at an old woman on her own property. Then everything happened too fast. More commands came. Mary tried to follow them, but confusion made her movements slow and unsure. Her foot caught on the edge of a loose stone near the walkway. She stumbled forward and grabbed the railing to steady herself. In that moment, the officers reacted as if danger had appeared. Mary felt a loud force hit her, and she fell hard onto the porch step. The bag spilled, and groceries rolled across the ground. Mary's body went still, not from choice, but from shock and pain. A neighbor screamed. Someone ran from across the street. The officers stood in place, and the street felt unreal, like a bad dream that refused to end. Mary's eyes were open, but her focus was distant. She tried to breathe, but her chest felt heavy. A few seconds later, one officer finally called for medical help. The call sounded urgent, but it sounded too late. Neighbors gathered at a safe distance. Some were crying. Some were shaking with anger. Some were filming, not to cause drama, but because they wanted proof. Mary had been a quiet woman who never threatened anyone. She had been carrying groceries, not danger. The community did not understand how a harmless moment turned into a loss. An ambulance arrived, and the paramedics rushed to her. They worked with focus and speed. They spoke calmly, but their faces were serious. Mary was carried away under bright lights that made the night look harsh. Her porch remained behind, with a broken bag and scattered food like a cruel picture. The wind pushed a bread roll into the gutter. A child's candy wrapper stuck to the damp sidewalk. Mary did not return home. By morning, the neighborhood felt quieter than it ever had. A heavy silence sat on the block, like fog that did not lift. Neighbors stood outside in small groups, speaking in low voices. They used Mary's name with respect, like a prayer. They talked about her kindness, her patience, and her habit of sharing what little she had. They also talked about the officers and the terrible misunderstanding. News reports began to spread the story. Some reports sounded cold and official. Some reports left out important details. People argued online, while the neighborhood mourned in real life. A small memorial formed by Mary's gate. Candles were placed carefully. Flowers appeared in jars. A handwritten note said that Mary deserved peace. Far away, in a quiet location where phones were checked and doors were heavy, Daniel received a call. He was in a plain room with plain walls. He listened without speaking. His face stayed controlled, but his eyes changed. The person on the phone spoke carefully, as if words could soften what happened. Daniel heard the truth anyway. His mother was gone. Daniel did not shout. He did not break anything, he did not collapse. He simply sat down and held his phone with both hands. For a long time, he stared at the floor, as if the world had shifted under him. He remembered Mary's voice telling him to stay humble. He remembered her telling him to protect life, not pride. He remembered her saying that strength meant restraint. Daniel had spent years training to stay calm under pressure. He had learned to breathe through chaos. He had learned to think clearly when others panicked. But this loss did not feel like a mission. It felt like his heart had been emptied in one sudden moment. Later that day, Daniel requested leave without giving details. He packed light. He wore simple clothes with no markings. He kept his hair plain and his expression neutral. He did not want attention. He did not want to be recognized. He wanted to return as a son, not as a title. When Daniel arrived in the city, he rented a small car and drove through familiar streets. He saw old shops that had changed names. He saw new signs on buildings that used to be empty. He also saw the same tired faces of people working hard to survive. As he got closer to Mary's block, his hands tightened on the steering wheel. He parked a few streets away and walked the rest of the distance. He wanted to feel the ground under his feet. At the corner, he saw the candles. He saw the flowers. He saw the notes pressed under small stones so the wind would not steal them. Daniel stopped and stood very still. For a moment, he looked like any man grieving, because that is what he was. Then he stepped closer and read the notes one by one. He did not cry in public, but his throat burned. He placed his hand on the fence and bowed his head. Daniel did not come back to cause harm. He did not come back for revenge. He came back for the truth, for accountability, and for his mother's dignity. He knew the difference between justice and anger. He also knew that if the truth was buried, the same tragedy could happen again. Daniel decided that he would speak to witnesses, request records, and follow every legal path. He would do it patiently, even if patience hurt. He would do it because Mary had taught him to fight with honor, not with chaos. As Daniel turned from the memorial, he noticed something that made him pause. A neighbor recognized him, not by fame, but by his eyes. The neighbor whispered Mary's son. Daniel nodded once, and the neighbor's face tightened with emotion. The neighbor said that many people had tried to speak, but they felt powerless. Daniel listened carefully, and his calm became a promise. He told the neighbor that the truth would not be ignored. He said that Mary's name would be protected. He said that the community would not stand alone. That night, Daniel sat in a small rented room and opened a notebook. He wrote down every detail he could gather. He wrote names, times, and locations. He wrote questions that needed answers. He wrote the word mother at the top of the page. Then he drew a single line under it like a vow. Outside, the city lights flickered, and sirens sounded far away. Daniel stared at the ceiling and knew the next days would test him in a different way. He was trained for danger, but now he faced grief, systems, and truth. And he would not leave until Mary's story was fully seen. Daniel woke before sunrise in the small rented room. The city outside was quiet, but his thoughts were loud. He sat up slowly and reminded himself to breathe. Mary had always said that rushing made mistakes grow. Daniel carried that lesson with him like armor. He left the room early and walked back toward the neighborhood. The air was cold and clear. Shops were opening, and workers waited at bus stops. Life moved forward even when grief stayed behind. Daniel watched people closely, not with suspicion, but with care. When he reached Mary's Street, a few neighbors were already outside. Some cleaned their steps. Some stood quietly near the memorial. Daniel approached slowly and kept his hands visible. He introduced himself simply as Mary's son. Faces softened the moment they heard that. An older man stepped forward and spoke first. He said Mary had helped his family many times. He said she never raised her voice at anyone. He said the night felt wrong from the start. Daniel listened without interrupting. A woman joined them and shared her memory. She said the voices were loud and confusing. She said Mary looked scared, not threatening. She said the commands came too fast. Daniel nodded and asked careful questions. He wrote everything down in his notebook. He noted times, directions, and positions. He asked where people were standing. He asked what lights were on. He asked what was said and when. More neighbors gathered as word spread. Each person shared a piece of the night. Some details matched closely. Some details were unclear. Daniel treated every voice with respect. He did not argue. He did not correct emotions. He understood that memory bends under shock. He only searched for patterns. Later that morning, Daniel visited the small store Mary used to walk to. The owner recognized him from childhood photos on Mary's wall. The owner looked away and sighed deeply. He said Mary had just left his shop that night. He said she joked about the cold air. The owner showed Daniel the receipt. The time was clear and printed. Daniel photographed it carefully. It matched the timeline the neighbors described. Truth was taking shape piece by piece. Daniel then went to the local community center. A meeting was already being planned there. People wanted answers. People wanted to be heard. Fear mixed with grief inside the room. Daniel stood near the back at first. He did not want attention. But someone recognized him and invited him forward. Daniel spoke calmly and clearly. He said he was not there to accuse. He said he was there to understand. He said his mother believed in dignity. He said he would honor that belief. The room grew quieter as he spoke. People listened because his voice carried restraint. He encouraged witnesses to share officially. He explained how records and reviews worked. He promised transparency and patience. That afternoon, Daniel requested public reports through legal channels. He followed procedures step by step. He did not use influence. He did not make threats. He trusted the process, even knowing it was slow. As the day went on, media crews arrived nearby. Cameras pointed toward the street. Questions filled the air. Daniel stayed out of sight. He believed grief was not a performance. He believed his mother deserved privacy. He also believed facts would speak louder than noise. In the evening, Daniel visited Mary's house alone. The door was locked just as she always kept it. He stood on the porch and touched the railing. It felt cold under his hand. Inside the house, everything was still. Mary's shoes were lined near the door. Her coat hung neatly by the wall. The smell of tea lingered faintly. Daniel sat at the small kitchen table. He imagined Mary sitting across from him. He imagined her gentle smile. He imagined her telling him to stay grounded. He opened another notebook and began writing memories. He wrote about her laughter. He wrote about her strength. He wrote about her belief in fairness. As night fell, Daniel reviewed everything he had collected. Timelines matched more clearly now. Witness accounts supported one another. Physical evidence filled the gaps. He noticed something important. Mary had been on her own property. She had been returning home peacefully. Nothing suggested intent or danger. Daniel felt sadness press harder against his chest. But he did not let it turn into bitterness. He knew anger could erase clarity. Clarity was what his mother would want. Before sleeping, Daniel made a plan. He would request an independent review. He would ensure witnesses felt protected. He would remain present and visible. The next morning, officials released a brief statement. It was careful and limited. It did not match what Daniel had learned. The gap between words and truth widened. Daniel responded with calm precision. He released verified facts only. He avoided speculation. He focused on timelines and records. Public attention shifted. Questions became sharper. People demanded more clarity. Throughout it all, Daniel stayed measured. He did not raise his voice. He did not insult anyone. He honored Mary through discipline. Neighbors began to feel supported. They spoke more confidently. They stood together more firmly. Fear slowly gave way to resolve. One evening, Daniel returned to the memorial. New candles had been added. More notes filled the fence. Mary's name was written again and again. Daniel placed a single flower at the center. He bowed his head briefly. He whispered a promise that stayed between them. The city around him continued to move. Cars passed. Lights changed. People hurried home. Daniel stood steady within that motion. He knew the road ahead would not be easy. He knew truth often met resistance. But he also knew patience could outlast denial. As he walked away, the memorial lights flickered softly. They reflected off the pavement like small stars. Daniel looked back once more. Mary's story was no longer silent. And this was only the beginning. Daniel spent the next day moving carefully through official steps. He met with a local attorney who was known for calm work and strict accuracy. The attorney's name was Nina. Nina spoke in short, clear sentences and listened more than she talked. She told Daniel that emotions were real, but evidence decided outcomes. Daniel agreed and placed his notebook on the table. Nina reviewed the timeline line by line. She asked Daniel to repeat details slowly. She marked where witness accounts matched and where they differed. She highlighted that Mary's store receipt was a strong anchor for the evening. She said the next step was to request more records in the proper way. Daniel did not want shortcuts. He wanted a path that could not be dismissed. Nina explained that public pressure could help, but only if it stayed factual. She warned that rumors would weaken the case and harm the community. Daniel promised that he would not feed rumors. That afternoon, Daniel and Nina visited the community center again. A larger crowd had gathered this time. Some people were tired from grief and stress. Some people were angry and loud. Some people were quiet but tense. Daniel walked in and stayed calm. He did not take the microphone immediately. He stood beside a table where neighbors could sign as witnesses if they chose. He greeted people with respect and kept his voice steady. He asked them to describe what they saw in simple terms. A young man named Malik spoke first. He said he was across the street and saw Mary arrive with a small bag. He said Mary moved slowly and looked confused. He said he heard commands that sounded harsh and rushed. He said he saw Mary stumble near the porch step. A woman named Rosa spoke next. She said Mary raised a hand as if to show she understood. She said the bag shifted and made noise. She said officers reacted as if the sound meant danger. Rosa's hands shook as she spoke, but she stayed honest. An older woman named Grace spoke after that. She said Mary was a careful person who avoided trouble. She said Mary never argued with anyone. She said Mary always carried herself with dignity. Grace said the neighborhood felt like it had lost a mother. Daniel listened to every person without rushing them. Nina wrote statements and asked witnesses to confirm details. The room began to feel more organized. People felt safer when the process looked real and structured. Later, a local reporter asked Daniel to speak on camera. Daniel agreed under one condition. He said the report must focus on facts and respect. The reporter nodded and promised fairness. Daniel stood outside the community center with a simple background behind him. He introduced himself as Mary's son. He said Mary was a peaceful woman. He said she deserved truth and dignity. He said the community deserved clarity and trust. He did not use dramatic words. He did not accuse individuals by name. He only described the timeline and confirmed that witnesses were prepared to speak. He also asked people to avoid rumor and to protect one another. The reporter looked surprised by his calm. The calm made the message stronger. That night, the interview spread quickly online. Comments appeared from all sides. Some were supportive. Some were suspicious. Some argued without understanding. Daniel avoided reading too much of it. He focused on what could be proven. The next morning, a meeting was scheduled with city officials. Daniel arrived with Nina and a folder of documents. He wore plain clothes and kept his posture steady. He did not act like he was above anyone. He acted like a citizen asking for truth. A city representative greeted them politely. The representative's name was Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed offered sympathy and repeated that the case was under review. Nina asked clear questions about the process. Mr. Reed gave careful answers that sounded practiced. Daniel noticed how often the words policy and procedure appeared. He understood that systems use those words to protect themselves. He also understood that systems can improve when truth is faced. Daniel asked for an independent review and a transparent timeline. Mr. Reed said he would pass the request forward. After the meeting, Nina pulled Daniel aside. She said the response felt too slow. She said delays were common when pressure increased. Daniel nodded and said the community would not be exhausted into silence. He said they would remain steady and organized. That afternoon, something unexpected happened. A former officer named Paul contacted Nina quietly. Paul said he had left the department years ago. Paul said he still cared about the city. Paul said he wanted to share what he knew about training and response patterns. They met Paul in a small cafe with soft music. Paul looked nervous and kept checking the window. He said that fear-based training can create fast reactions. He said some officers learn to expect danger in every movement. He said this mindset can lead to tragedies when patience is missing. He did not offer excuses. He offered context and concern. Paul also mentioned that body camera use is not always consistent. He said some cameras fail for simple reasons. He said sometimes they are not activated correctly. He said this creates gaps that damage public trust. Nina wrote down his points carefully. Daniel asked Paul one question. He asked what kind of training would have helped that night. Paul said communication and calm distance would have helped. Paul said patience would have helped. Paul said treating Mary as a resident, not as a threat, would have helped. Daniel thanked Paul for speaking. Daniel did not ask Paul to take risks beyond his comfort. He asked only for honesty and cooperation through proper channels. Paul said he would consider giving a formal statement. As days passed, the neighborhood changed. More people attended meetings. More neighbors checked on each other. More local leaders stepped forward to help organize. Mary's Street became a symbol of community strength. Daniel noticed young people showing up too. They carried signs that asked for fairness. They also carried water for elders. They helped clean up after meetings. They treated the space with respect. Daniel spoke with them privately. He told them to stay peaceful and focused. He told them to protect their future by protecting the truth. He told them to avoid disrespect and avoid conflict. They listened because he spoke like someone who understood discipline. That evening, Daniel returned to Mary's home again. He found a small box in her closet. Inside were letters she had written but never sent. Some letters were to friends from long ago. Some were to Daniel. Each letter carried her gentle voice. Daniel opened one addressed to him. It said she was proud of his heart more than his achievements. It said she hoped he would always choose fairness. It said he should never let grief turn him hard. Daniel held the letter close and felt tears rise. He did not fight them this time. He let them fall quietly. In that moment, Daniel understood something deeper. This was not only about a case. This was about restoring trust and preventing future loss. Mary's life was a message to him and to the city. The message was simple and strong. Be careful with power. Be slow with fear. Be honest with truth. The next day, new information arrived through official requests. Some records confirmed parts of the timeline. Some records raised new questions. Nina said they were getting closer to the full picture. Daniel looked at the pages and felt the weight of responsibility. He knew part 4 would be the hardest. Not because of anger. Because truth sometimes forces people to change. And change is where resistance becomes loud. Still, Daniel stayed steady. Mary's voice was with him in every decision. And the community stood beside him, ready to face what came next. Daniel and Nina spent the next week building a clear record that could not be pushed aside. They organized witness statements in a simple order that matched the timeline. They attached the store receipt and photos from the memorial as proof of Mary's normal routine. They included maps of the street and marked where each witness stood that night. They requested more official records through the correct legal path and tracked every response date. They avoided dramatic language and used plain facts that anyone could understand. When the new records arrived, Nina read them slowly and twice. Some details were missing, and some lines raised questions that demanded answers. One document confirmed the time officers arrived on the block. Another document confirmed that a call had been made about suspicion, but it did not explain why Mary was treated as a threat. A short report described events in a way that did not match what the neighborhood had seen. Daniel felt the familiar pull of frustration, but he held it back and stayed steady. Nina arranged a formal request for an independent review, and the city could not ignore it anymore. Public attention had grown, but Daniel kept the focus on truth rather than noise. Community leaders joined the request and signed their names without fear. A local pastor named Tom offered the community center for meetings whenever needed. A teacher named Sarah helped neighbors write clear statements if they struggled with words. A shop owner named Ben printed copies of timelines and handed them out for free. Mary's Street no longer felt isolated, because many hands were holding it up. A few days later, the city announced a public meeting to address concerns. The room was full, but the crowd stayed calm and respectful. Daniel sat in the front row beside Nina, not to show power, but to show presence. Officials spoke in careful phrases, but the community asked direct questions. Neighbors wanted to know why simple patience was missing that night. Neighbors wanted to know why Mary's harmless return home became danger in someone's mind. Neighbors wanted to know what would change so another family would not face the same grief. When Daniel was invited to speak, he stood slowly and looked around the room. He said Mary was not a headline, and she was not a symbol because she was a real person with a real life. He said she deserved to be remembered for her kindness and her dignity. He said the community deserved a system that reacts with care instead of fear. He said he would continue to follow every legal step, and he asked the city to do the same with honesty. His voice did not shake, but it carried weight that made the room listen. After Daniel spoke, a witness who had been quiet before finally stood up. Her name was Lily, and she said she lived 2 houses away from Mary. She said she had been afraid to speak because she worried about being dismissed. She said she saw Mary lift her hand in confusion and heard Mary trying to explain. She said she saw the groceries fall and roll across the walkway. Her words were simple, but they landed hard on everyone present. Nina thanked her and guided her to sign a statement in a calm private corner. That same week, Paul, the former officer, decided to give a formal statement. He said he was speaking because he believed trust matters more than comfort. He described common patterns that can lead to fast reactions when training leans too heavily on fear. He said that better communication and safer distance could reduce mistakes. He said the community needed transparency, because secrecy grows suspicion. His statement did not accuse people by name, but it challenged the system to improve. Soon after, the independent review team contacted Nina for interviews. They requested witness lists, documents, and timelines, and Nina provided everything in a clean, organized file. The reviewers spoke to neighbors and compared stories for consistency. They also examined official records and asked why key details were missing or unclear. The process was slow, but it finally felt real. Daniel stayed close to the community and kept people updated with facts only. During this time, Daniel also focused on Mary's home, because it carried her spirit. He cleaned the porch steps and fixed the loose stone that had caused her stumble. He put the groceries list back on the fridge where Mary used to keep it. He found her small garden tools and placed them neatly in a box. He repaired a broken fence board that Mary had always meant to fix. These small tasks did not erase grief, but they helped Daniel breathe. One evening, Tom invited Daniel to a quiet gathering at the community center. There were no cameras and no speeches that night. People shared stories about Mary and laughed gently through tears. They talked about how she remembered birthdays and how she slipped candy to kids who tried to act tough. They talked about how she listened when others felt unseen. Daniel realized that Mary's real strength was not in fighting, but in caring without condition. In that gathering, Daniel made a proposal that surprised some people. He suggested a community program focused on calm communication and safer responses. He said it could include meetings between residents and local officers in a controlled, respectful setting. He said the goal would be understanding and prevention, not blame and conflict. Some people doubted it at first because their trust was wounded. But Sarah the teacher said that prevention was a form of protection too. Ben the shop owner said that if Mary could greet strangers with respect, others could learn to do the same. Days later, the Independent Review released a summary of findings. It acknowledged that the response that night failed to match the situation Mary presented. It stated that clearer communication and better judgment were needed. It also recommended changes in training and stronger accountability steps. The report did not heal everything, but it confirmed that Mary's truth had not been buried. Neighbors felt a mix of relief and sorrow, because validation does not bring a loved one back. Daniel read the report alone in Mary's kitchen. He placed Mary's letter beside the pages and kept his hand on it. He whispered that he had kept his promise to protect her dignity. He also whispered that he would keep going, because one report was not the end. He wanted change that lasted beyond attention and beyond news cycles. A month later, Mary's street looked different in a quiet way. The memorial was smaller now, but it was still there. A new bench sat near the fence with a small sign that carried Mary's name. Children sometimes sat on it while waiting for rides after school. Neighbors kept the area clean because they felt responsible for her memory. The community center hosted monthly meetings focused on safety, respect, and clear reporting. Some officers attended and listened, and the tone was careful but improving. On a warm evening, Daniel returned to the porch steps where Mary used to sit. He held a cup of tea the way she used to hold it. He watched the sky change color and listened to the street sounds. A child ran past laughing, and a neighbor waved from across the road. Daniel felt grief still present, but it no longer controlled his breathing. He understood that love could turn pain into purpose when it stays disciplined. Before he left, Daniel stood and looked at the quiet street one more time. He did not think about revenge, because Mary never taught him that path. He thought about prevention, accountability, and dignity, because Mary lived those values every day. He promised himself that wherever he went next, he would carry her lessons forward. Then he closed the gate gently and walked down the sidewalk with steady steps. Mary's story had begun with tragedy, but it ended with truth standing in the open.